So in the following video, what I wanted to do is give you a sample of the Cornell note-taking style in real time. So let's review first what the Cornell note-taking style is all about. It's really a way to organize your notes. So if you look at the following, this is how your page is to be divided. On the left-hand side, there's a column. It's called the Q column, and this is usually filled out just after lecture, just after class, and it includes anticipated exam questions, which is the portion I really love about this style, main concepts, vocabulary, words. It's really a great column because if you cover everything up as you're studying, it becomes a great cue for studying. The next section is the real meat of the note. This is where you're actually taking down the content. So what are the main points, any sub-points, diagrams? Obviously, it's all paraphrased in your own words, etc. And the last section is the summary section. This section is great because it's that at a glance view of the topic of this note. So what I want to do here is I'm actually going to do a note in real time. So what we have is we have a Yale University open lecture video, and it's great. It's a video about psychology, particularly Freud's theory of motivation and the id, ego, and superego. And I haven't actually drawn the lines on my note sheet as of yet. I'm using OneNote, and I didn't really want to draw lines because it gets a little glitchy. So I've indicated my note column and my main note area, and down below will be my summary section. So once I've finished listening to the lecture and jotting down my notes, I will go back to fill out the column section and to fill out the summary section as well. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to get started, and you feel free to listen up.
But at the core of Freud's explanation, the more interesting idea is a set of claims of immense intellectual importance. And the two main ones are this. The two main ones involve the existence of an unconscious motivation, and the notion of unconscious dynamics or unconscious conflict, which lead to mental illnesses, dreams, slips of the tongue, and so on. The first idea, the idea of unconscious motivation, involves rejecting the claim that you know what you're doing. So suppose you fall in love with somebody and you decide you want to marry them. And then somebody was asked to ask you why. And you'd say something like, well, I'm ready to get married at this stage of my life. I really love the person is smart and attractive. I want to have kids, whatever. And maybe this is true. But a Freudian might say that even if this is your honest answer, you're not lying to anybody else. Still, there are desires and motivations that govern your behavior that you may not be aware of. So, in fact, you might want to marry John because he reminds you of your father, or because you want to get back at somebody for betraying you. If somebody was to tell you this, you'd say, that's total nonsense. But that wouldn't deter a Freudian. A Freudian would say that these processes are unconscious. So, of course, you just don't know what's happening. So the radical idea here is you might not know why you do what you do. And this is something we accept for things like visual perception. We accept that you look around the world and you get sensations and you figure out there's a car, there's a tree, there's a person, and you're just unconscious of how this happens. But it's unpleasant and kind of frightening that this could happen, that this could apply to things like why you're now studying at Yale, why you feel the way you do towards your friends, towards your family. Now, the marriage case is extreme, but Freud gives a lot of simpler examples where this sort of unconscious motivation might play a role. So, have you ever liked somebody or disliked them and not know why? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you're doing something, or you're arguing for something, or making a decision for reasons that you can't fully articulate? Have you ever forgotten somebody's name at exactly the wrong time? Have you ever called out the wrong name in the throes of passion? This is all the Freudian unconscious. The idea is that we do these things. These things are explained in terms of cognitive systems that we're not aware of. Now, all of this would be fine if your unconscious was a reasonable, rational computer, if your unconscious was really smart and looking out for your best interests. But according to Freud, that's not the way it works. According to Freud, there are three distinct processes going on in your head, and these are in violent internal conflict. And the way you act and the way you think are products not of a singular, rational being, but of a set of conflicting creatures. And these three parts are the id, the ego, and the superego. And they emerge developmentally. The id, according to Freud, is present at birth. It's the animal part of the self. It wants to eat, drink, pee, poop, get warm, and have sexual satisfaction. It is outrageously stupid. It works on what Freud called a pleasure principle. It wants pleasure, and it wants it now. And that's, according to Freud, how a human begins. Pure id. Freud had this wonderful phrase, polymorphous perversity. This pure desire for pleasure. Now, unfortunately, life doesn't work like that. What you want isn't always what you get. And this leads to a set of reactions to cope with the fact that pleasure isn't always there when you want it, either by planning how to satisfy your desires or planning how to suppress them. And this system is known as the ego, or the self. And it works on the reality principle. And it works on the principle of trying to figure out how to make your way through the world, how to satisfy your pleasures, or, in some cases, how to give up on them. And the ego, the emergence of the ego, for Freud, symbolizes the origin of consciousness. Finally, if this was all there was, it might be a simpler world. But Freud had a third component, that of the superego. And the superego is the internalized rules of parents and society. So what happens in the course of development is you're just trying to make your way through the world and satisfy your desires, but sometimes you're punished for them. Some desires are inappropriate, some actions are wrong, and you're punished for it. The idea is that you come out, you get in your head a superego, a conscience. In these movies, it would be like the little angel above your head that tells you when things are wrong. And basically, yourself, the ego, is in between the id and the superego. One thing to realize, I told you the id is outrageously stupid. It just says, oh, hungry, food, sex, oh, let's get warm, oh. The superego is also stupid. The superego, according to Freud, is not some brilliant moral philosopher telling you about right and wrong. The superego is like, you should be ashamed of yourself. That's disgusting. Stop doing that. Oh! And in between these two screaming creatures, one of them telling you to seek out your desires, the other one telling you should be ashamed of yourself, is you, is the ego. Now, according to Freud, most of this is unconscious. So we see, bubbling up to the top, we feel, we experience ourselves. And the driving of the id, the forces of the id and the forces of the superego are unconscious, in that we cannot access them. We don't know it's like the workings of our kidneys or our stomachs. You can't introspect and find them. Rather, they do their work without conscious knowledge. Now, Freud developed this. This is the Freudian theory in broad outline.
So that's the lecture. And let me just minimize that and make this a little larger, just so we can get a sense of the note as a whole. So far, our note looks as you see here on the screen. So if now that the lecture is over, I'm going to go through and fill out the Q column. So what motivates us? How are our actions controlled? Okay. What processes are in conflict in our subconscious. How do these processes affect our actions, our development, our, our decisions? What are the how do the id, ego, and superego interact? Okay, so those questions seem to be fairly reasonable for the lesson or the lecture that we read. Now let's go through and create our summary column. Summary section. So the main ideas of this lesson have been really that unconscious, there are desires and motivations in people that are unconscious, and then the id, ego, superego are in conflict and mediate many of our actions. And finally, it's all unconscious and inaccessible. So when you're doing notes, I know a lot of people get really annoyed with the red underline. That's fine, but really wait for after the lesson or the lesson or the lecture is over to correct some of those things. So what I want to do right now is I want to go through and just kind of give you an idea of where my head was at as I was going through taking notes. So obviously I have this, that it's Freud's theory. That's important because this could be any psychologist's theory. When he started this section of the lecture, he said very clearly there are two important structures that Freud identified pertaining to motivation. And I automatically wrote down 1 and 2. I wrote down those structures. Because I'm doing a digital note, it really becomes pretty simple to now go fill in what each of those structures are. So I went back and I indented. The indent helps me identify that all of this information pertains to the unconscious motivation. Notice I didn't exactly type out his statements word for word. I put them in my own words. I condensed them. I chopped them up. But what I really needed to make sure I put in there was some examples. So I put one example that he mentioned, but then when he mentioned an example, it got me to think about something that happened in my life. So when I forgot my cousin's name at her wedding, that was important that I make a personal connection to this information. So then when he started talking about the 3 processes, and he's a great lecturer, he before going on to talk about all the concepts, he introduces them with numbers. There are 2 of this, there are 3 of this, first this, second this. So these are all cues to help you as a note taker. So he mentioned the 3 processes, and I chose to put them in a chart such as this. You can choose to do it vertically or horizontally. This was easier for me. So id, ego, and superego. And again, I put down very minimal points, but now I know when I see the word animal, I think instincts, id. I think it's the devil on your shoulders in a movie, for example. Ego, it's the self, it's the mediator of the devil and the angel. And then the superego is the rules that we learn and the punishments and then the shame and the guilt, all of those feelings because we haven't lived up to the society's rules. And that's the angel part of that movie metaphor he mentioned. And then obviously my last point was that it's all unconscious and not accessible, and that's really important to remember. So hopefully this was a good example for you, and thank you for listening.